For 12 years, Margaret Chen delivered flowers for Dean Martin, every single week, without fail, always the same arrangement, white roses, lilies, eucalyptus, always with a card that said the same thing, "I miss you every day." No signature, no recipient's name, just an address. Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. Margaret assumed they were for someone important, maybe Dean's mother, maybe a lost love, maybe a friend who'd passed too soon. She never asked. It wasn't her place. But in December 1995, when Dean Martin died, Margaret finally learned the truth. The flowers were never for a woman. They were never for a friend. They were for a grave, the grave of Dean Paul Martin, Dean's son, a pilot, a father, a boy who died in 1987 and took his father's heart with him. And when Margaret discovered who those flowers were really for, everything changed. Not just her understanding of Dean Martin, but her understanding of grief, love, and what it means to keep living when the person you love most is gone. Beverly Hills. Margaret Chen had just opened her flower shop, Petals and Stems, on a quiet corner 2 blocks from Rodeo Drive. It was a small shop, but Margaret had a gift. She understood flowers the way some people understand music. She knew which blooms spoke of love, which spoke of apology, which spoke of grief. Her clientele was mostly local, wealthy housewives, business executives, the occasional celebrity assistant picking up an arrangement for their boss. But one Thursday morning in October, the phone rang, and everything changed. "Petals and Stems, this is Margaret." "Hello, my name is Dean Martin. I'd like to order flowers." Margaret froze. Dean Martin, the Dean Martin, the king of cool. The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakable, smooth, warm, but with something underneath, something heavy. "Of course, Mr. Martin. What would you like?" "White roses, lilies, some greenery, eucalyptus if you have it. Nothing too elaborate, just clean, simple, beautiful." "That sounds lovely. Is this for a special occasion?" A pause. "You could say that. I need them delivered to Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. Every week. Same arrangement. Same day. Thursdays." Margaret wrote it down. "Every week? Every week. Can you do that?" "Absolutely. And would you like a card with a message?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes. Just write, 'I miss you every day.' No signature. No signature? No signature." Margaret didn't push. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Martin. Thank you." And he hung up. That first Thursday, Margaret prepared the arrangement herself. White roses, their petals perfect and unblemished. Stargazer lilies, elegant and fragrant. Eucalyptus branches for texture and a touch of green. She wrapped them carefully, attached the card, "I miss you every day," and drove to Westwood Village Memorial Park herself. She'd been to the cemetery before. It was where many Hollywood legends were buried. Marilyn Monroe, Natalie Wood, Truman Capote. But Margaret didn't know where to deliver the flowers. The address Dean had given was just the cemetery's main office. When she arrived, she asked the attendant, "I have a delivery for Dean Martin." He didn't specify a plot. The attendant checked his records. "Dean Paul Martin, Section D, Plot 152. Margaret thanked him and walked through the cemetery until she found it. A simple headstone, modest, understated. Dean Paul Martin, November 17th, 1951. March 21st, 1987. Beloved son, father, and pilot. Margaret placed the flowers gently at the base of the headstone. She stood there for a moment, reading the dates. 1987. That was only 4 years ago. And Dean Paul had been so young, 35. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. She didn't know the story, but she understood loss. She'd lost her own father when she was 23. She knew what it felt like to visit a grave and wish desperately that the person could somehow know you were there. She drove back to the shop in silence. The next Thursday, Dean called again. "Margaret, it's Dean Martin. Same arrangement, please." "Of course, Mr. Martin. I'll have it delivered this afternoon." "Thank you." Click. This became the pattern. Every Thursday, like clockwork, Dean would call. Always around 10 in the morning. Always the same order. Always the same message on the card. And every Thursday, Margaret would prepare the arrangement and deliver it herself. She never told anyone. Not her employees, not her friends, not even her husband. It felt private, sacred, like she'd been entrusted with something precious, and to speak about it would be a betrayal. Over the months, Margaret began to notice things. Dean's voice. It never changed in tone, but there was always that weight underneath, that sadness. Some weeks it was heavier than others. Some weeks, Dean's voice would crack slightly when he said, "Thank you," and Margaret would feel her own throat tighten in response. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but she didn't know how, so she just kept delivering the flowers. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5. Margaret's business grew. She hired more staff, expanded the shop, started doing arrangements for weddings, galas, movie premieres. But every Thursday, no matter how busy she was, Margaret personally prepared Dean Martin's flowers. And every Thursday, she personally delivered them to Dean Paul's grave. She began to recognize the other regular visitors at the cemetery. An elderly woman who brought daisies to her husband's grave, a young man who sat by his sister's headstone and read aloud from books. And occasionally, Margaret would see signs that someone else had been to Dean Paul's grave. A small toy airplane left beside the flowers, a photograph tucked into the arrangement. Once, a handwritten note that simply said, "Love, Dad." Margaret never touched these items. She would place her flowers carefully beside them, making sure not to disturb anything. It felt like she was participating in something larger than herself, a ritual of remembrance, a father's love that refused to fade. In 1990, Margaret read in the newspaper that Sammy Davis Jr. had died. She knew Dean and Sammy had been close, part of the Rat Pack, brothers in a way. That Thursday when Dean called, his voice was different, flatter, more distant. "Margaret, same arrangement." "Of course, Mr. Martin. I'm very sorry about Mr. Davis." Silence. Then, quietly, "Thank you." That week, when Margaret delivered the flowers, she noticed something new at Dean Paul's grave, a program from Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral. It was placed carefully on the headstone held down by a small rock. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She understood. Dean had brought Sammy to meet his son. Or maybe he'd come to his son's grave to grieve for Sammy. Either way, it was clear. This grave wasn't just where Dean Paul rested. It was where Dean Martin came to feel everything he couldn't feel anywhere else. By 1993, Margaret had been delivering flowers for 10 years. She'd never met Dean Martin in person, never seen him at the cemetery. Their entire relationship existed in those brief Thursday phone calls and the silent ritual of flowers on a grave. But Margaret felt connected to him in a way she couldn't quite explain. She felt like she knew him, not the performer, not the celebrity, but the father, the grieving man who refused to let his son be forgotten. One Thursday in November, Dean's call came later than usual. It was almost noon. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I know it's late." "It's no problem at all, Mr. Martin. I was at the cemetery this morning. I lost track of time." Margaret's heart skipped. "You were there? I go every week. I just usually go after you've delivered the flowers. But today I went early, and I was still there when you arrived. I saw you." Margaret didn't know what to say. "I didn't want to bother you," Dean continued, "but I wanted you to know. I see the care you put into the arrangements. I see how you place them, how you make sure everything is perfect. And I want you to know it means everything to me." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "It's an honor, Mr. Martin." "No," Dean said softly. "The honor is mine." After that conversation, things shifted slightly. Dean still called every Thursday, still ordered the same flowers, but occasionally he'd add something, a small detail, a memory. "Dean Paul loved white roses," he said once. "His mother used to grow them in the garden when he was a kid." Another time, "He was a hell of a pilot, the best. He loved flying more than anything, except maybe his son." And once, his voice barely a whisper, "I should have been there. I should have stopped him from flying that day. I should have done something." "Mr. Martin," Margaret said gently, "you couldn't have known." "I'm his father," Dean said. "I should have known." Margaret didn't know how to respond, so she just said, "The flowers will be there this afternoon." "Thank you, Margaret." In March 1995, Margaret was making her usual Thursday delivery. It was a beautiful day, sunny, warm, the kind of day that made you forget for a moment that you were in a cemetery surrounded by death. Margaret walked to Dean Paul's grave, the arrangement cradled carefully in her arms. And then she stopped. Dean Martin was there. He was standing beside the grave, his hands in his pockets, staring down at the headstone. He looked older than Margaret had imagined, thinner, frailer. His face was lined with exhaustion and grief. Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to intrude, but she had the flowers. She approached slowly. "Mr. Martin?" Dean turned. For a moment he looked confused. Then recognition dawned. "Margaret? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." He gestured to the flowers. "Are those for me?" Margaret smiled. "They're for your son." Dean's face softened. He took the arrangement from her and knelt down, placing it carefully at the base of the headstone. His hands lingered on the flowers for a moment, adjusting them, making sure they were perfect. Then he stood up slowly, his knees creaking. 12 years, he said quietly. 12 years you've been doing this. It's been an honor." Dean looked at her, really looked at her. "Do you know what it's like to lose a child, Margaret?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I can't imagine." "It's like losing your future," Dean said. "Everything you thought your life would be, everything you hoped for, it all dies with them, and you're left with nothing but the past. And the past isn't enough. It's never enough." Margaret didn't know what to say, so she just stood there beside this man she'd never met, but somehow knew intimately, and let him talk. "I come here every week," Dean continued, "sometimes more. I sit here and I talk to him. I tell him about my day, about his siblings, about stupid things, like what I had for breakfast or what's on TV. Because if I stop talking to him, then he's really gone, and I can't let that happen." He paused. "But on the weeks when I can't come, when I'm too sick or too tired or just too goddamn sad to get out of bed, I know the flowers will still be here, because of you, and that gives me peace. It lets me know that even when I can't be here, someone is still remembering him. Someone is still saying, 'You mattered. You were loved. You are not forgotten.'" Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "He mattered, Mr. Martin. I never met him, but I know he mattered." Dean smiled, a sad, broken smile. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a few more moments. Then Dean said, "I should let you get back to work. Take care of yourself, Mr. Martin." "I'll try." But Margaret could see in his eyes that he wouldn't, that he'd stopped trying a long time ago. December 25th, 1995. Christmas Day. Margaret was at home with her family when the news broke. Dean Martin had died. Respiratory failure. He was 78 years old. Margaret sat on her couch staring at the TV, tears streaming down her face. Her husband put his arm around her. "Did you know him?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I knew him. The funeral was private, family only." But a week later, a woman walked into Margaret's shop. She was in her 40s, elegant, with Dean Martin's eyes. "Are you Margaret Chen?" the woman asked. "Yes. I'm Deanna Martin, Dean's daughter." Margaret stood up. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Deanna smiled sadly. "Thank you. I wanted to come by because my father talked about you. A lot. Especially in the last few years." "He did. He said you were the only person who understood, who never asked questions, who never judged, who just helped him keep Dean Paul alive." Deanna reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "He wanted you to have this." Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten note on Dean Martin's personal stationery. "Margaret, thank you for 12 years of kindness. Thank you for treating my son's memory with the care and respect he deserved. Thank you for never making me explain my grief. You kept him alive for me. You'll never know how much that meant. With gratitude and respect, Dean Martin." Margaret collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Deanna knelt beside her. "He also wanted you to know something. The flowers, they weren't just for Dean Paul." Margaret looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "My father went to that grave every week for 8 years. But he wasn't just visiting Dean Paul, he was visiting himself. The version of himself that died the day his son did. He told me once that when Dean Paul's plane went down, the best part of him went down with it. And the only way he could keep living was to visit that grave and remember what it felt like to be whole." Deanna wiped her eyes. "So when you delivered those flowers every week, you weren't just honoring Dean Paul. You were honoring my father's grief, his love, his refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. Margaret couldn't speak. Dina stood up. There's one more thing. My father left instructions. He wanted to be buried next to Dean Paul, and he wanted you to deliver the flowers. One last time. Margaret nodded. I will. A week later, Margaret stood in Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. Dean Martin's funeral had just ended. The crowd had dispersed. It was just Margaret now, standing between two graves, father and son, side by side. She placed the arrangement carefully between them. White roses, lilies, eucalyptus, the same arrangement she'd been making for 12 years. She attached the card, but this time she changed the message. You're together now. Rest in peace. Margaret stood there for a long time, looking at the two headstones. Dean Paul Martin, 1951-1987. Dean Martin, 1917-1995. A father and son, separated by 8 years of grief, now reunited in death. And Margaret realized something. For 12 years, she'd thought she was just delivering flowers. But she'd been doing something much more important. She'd been delivering love. She'd been delivering hope. She'd been delivering a father's promise to his son, I will never forget you. I will never stop loving you. I will never let you go. And in doing that, she'd helped Dean Martin survive. Not live, but survive. 1 week at a time, one arrangement at a time, one small act of remembrance at a time. Margaret continued to visit the graves, not every week, but often. She'd bring flowers, not because anyone was paying her, but because it felt right. Because Dean and Dean Paul had become part of her life, part of her story. One day, a few years after Dean's death, Margaret was at the cemetery when a young man approached. He was in his 20s, handsome, with Dean Martin's smile. Excuse me, he said. Are you Margaret? Yes. I'm Alexander Martin, Dean Paul's son, Dean Martin's grandson. Margaret's breath caught. It's nice to meet you. I wanted to thank you, Alexander said. My mom told me what you did, how you delivered flowers for my grandfather all those years, how you helped him remember my dad. It was an honor, Margaret said. Alexander looked at the graves. I never met my grandfather. He died when I was young, and I barely remember my dad. I was only 3 when he died, but because of people like you, I know they were loved. I know they mattered, and that means everything to me. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. They did matter. Very much. Alexander smiled. Thank you for keeping their memory alive. Today, Margaret Chen is 78 years old, the same age Dean Martin was when he died. She's retired now, sold the flower shop, but she still visits Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, still brings flowers to the graves of Dean Martin and Dean Paul Martin. Not every week, but often enough, because some rituals are too important to abandon. Some loves are too deep to forget, and some stories need to be remembered. The story of a father who loved his son so much that he spent the last 8 years of his life visiting a grave. The story of a florist who understood that flowers aren't just flowers. They're messages, promises, acts of love that transcend death. The story of grief that doesn't end, but transforms, that finds new ways to exist, new rituals, new meanings. Dean Martin once said in an interview, years before Dean Paul died, the most important thing in life is family. Everything else is just noise. He didn't know then how true those words would become, how family would be the thing that destroyed him and the thing that kept him alive, how love would be both his greatest joy and his deepest pain. For 12 years, Margaret Chen was part of that love, part of that pain, part of the ritual that allowed a broken father to keep breathing. She never asked for recognition, never sought attention. She just delivered flowers, week after week, year after year. A simple act, but simple acts, done with love, can change everything. They can keep a memory alive. They can honor a life lost. They can give a grieving father permission to keep living, even when living feels impossible. If this story moved you, think about the small acts of kindness in your own life, the rituals you perform, the people you remember, the ways you keep love alive, even after death, because that's what we're all doing, really. We're all just trying to hold on to the people we've lost, trying to prove that love doesn't end when someone dies. That memory is a form of immortality, that as long as someone remembers, the person we loved is never truly gone. Dean Martin knew that. Margaret Chen knew that. And now maybe you know it too. Because everybody loves somebody. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is simply refusing to forget.